Imagine a city in the early 18th century. London, perhaps, or Paris, it hardly matters which. The streets are narrow and shadowed, the air heavy with coal smoke and damp wool, and in a modest room above a shop, a mother holds her infant to the window's thin light, studying the child's face with the kind of attention that has nothing to do with admiration. She is searching. A faint reddening of the skin, a cluster of small raised marks near the hairline, the first suggestion of something that nearly every family in Europe expects to encounter sooner or later. It is not a question of whether the moment will come, but when. The condition she fears has no name yet in our story, but it hangs over this room, over every room in every city across the continent, like a weather system that never fully clears. No fortune is large enough to buy exemption. No title of nobility serves as a shield. In the palaces of kings, the same uneasy watchfulness persists. In the cramped quarters where laborers sleep four to a bed, the same silent apprehension fills the air each time a child develops a fever. That condition was smallpox, variola, a word derived from the Latin for spotted or stained, a modest etymology for a disease that would prove to be among the most consequential forces in all of human history. Its origins are ancient beyond reliable tracing. Some paleopathologists have pointed to the mummified remains of Pharaoh Ramesses V, who ruled Egypt more than 3,000 years ago, as the earliest physical evidence. His preserved skin bears marks across the face and shoulders, small, round impressions that modern experts have interpreted as consistent with a pox-like illness, fossilized in the dry air of the Nile Valley across 31 centuries. Whether this identification is definitive remains debated, but what it gestures toward is significant. This was a disease of extraordinary antiquity, one that had accompanied humanity for millennia before anyone recorded its name in a medical treatise. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, smallpox, or something closely resembling it, announced itself on the grandest possible stage. A devastating epidemic swept through the Roman Empire beginning around 165, persisting for nearly 15 years. Known as the Antonine episode, it ravaged legions, emptied commercial cities, and may have claimed between 5 and 10 million lives. The physician Galen left clinical descriptions that many scholars interpret as consistent with smallpox, though certainty is impossible across so great a distance of time. Military campaigns were abandoned. Tax revenues collapsed. Some historians have argued that this contagion marked the beginning of Rome's long, imperceptible weakening, a fracture hidden beneath the sheer inertia of imperial power. Centuries passed. The disease persisted, traveling the arteries of trade and conquest, but it had not yet reached its full geographic range. That expansion would come with the age of European exploration, and when the virus finally crossed the Atlantic, the consequences surpassed anything the Old World had witnessed. Smallpox arrived in the Americas not as an announced invader but as an invisible passenger, carried in the bodies of European sailors and soldiers who had long since survived the disease themselves. The populations of the Western Hemisphere had never encountered variola. They possessed no inherited familiarity with the virus, and so, when it arrived, it moved through communities with a speed that stunned even the conquering Europeans. When Hernán Cortés marched toward the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, he carried something far more powerful than gunpowder or Toledo steel. Smallpox reached the city before the final siege began, spreading through its dense population with merciless efficiency. The Emperor Cuitlahuac, who had organized fierce resistance against the Spanish, succumbed after ruling only 80 days. When the conquistadors finally entered the capital, they found it already hollowed out, its defenders weakened not by any failing of courage, but by an enemy no obsidian blade could touch. The pattern repeated across the hemisphere. In the Inca Empire, the virus arrived before Pizarro did. The Emperor Huayna Capac and his chosen heir both fell to the disease around 1527, and the succession crisis that followed tore the empire apart on the eve of invasion. Across North America, from the Mississippi Valley to the coastal Northeast, the same devastating sequence unfolded. The precise demographic toll remains debated, but the broad consensus suggests that the indigenous population of the Americas declined by as much as 90% in the century and a half following European contact, with smallpox foremost among the causes. Entire languages fell silent. Systems of governance, agriculture, and spiritual understanding were swept away. What vanished was not merely life in the aggregate, but irreplaceable worlds of knowledge and meaning, erased by a pathogen measured in billionths of a meter. In Europe itself, smallpox settled into a different equilibrium, not the sudden, overwhelming catastrophe it had inflicted upon the Americas, but a slow, grinding presence woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the disease was simply a fact of life. Nearly everyone encountered the virus at some point, usually in childhood. Those who survived bore the marks for the rest of their days. The pockmarked face became so ubiquitous that in some cities, having smooth skin was considered remarkable enough to note in official documents. A face without scars was the exception. The virus recognized no rank and honored no bloodline. Queen Mary II of England succumbed to it in 1694, at 32. Emperor Joseph, the first of the Holy Roman Empire, was lost in 1711. Tsar Peter II of Russia perished at just 14 in 1730. King Louis XV of France breathed his last after contracting the virus in 1774. No throne, no palace guard, no retinue of personal physicians could hold the contagion at bay. By the mid-18th century, smallpox was claiming roughly 400,000 European lives every year. Approximately 1 in 3 who contracted the disease did not survive. Among infants, the toll was steeper still. Of those who recovered, many were left with permanent scarring, and some lost their sight entirely. It was, by nearly any measure, the most formidable infectious threat in the Western world. And yet the physicians of Europe stood largely powerless. They could observe the stages of the illness. They could classify its symptoms in meticulous Latin. They could prescribe the traditional remedies, purgatives, tonics, rest, and prayer, but they could not prevent the disease and they could not cure it. The finest medical minds of London, Paris, Leiden, and Edinburgh confronted an adversary they could not see, could not explain, and could not overcome. What those physicians did not know was that an answer already existed. It did not reside in their universities or their hospitals. It had not been formulated in their treatises or debated in their academies. The answer was elsewhere, in the folk practices of cultures that European science had never thought to consult. In the mountains of China, in the villages of the Indian subcontinent, in the domestic quarters of Ottoman Constantinople, ordinary people had been confronting this ancient enemy for generations, not with grand theories, but with close observation, practical daring, and a willingness to act on incomplete knowledge that no European faculty of medicine would have sanctioned. The most transformative chapter in the history of medicine was about to begin, and it would start not in a Western laboratory, but in the hands of people whose names were never recorded in any European archive. The practice may have begun in China. The exact date is impossible to fix. It drifts through the centuries like smoke, claimed by various sources for various eras, with none entirely certain. Some Chinese medical texts attribute the technique to the 10th century, to physicians serving under the Song dynasty. Others place it later during the Ming period, when written references become more specific. What is clear is that by the 1600s, a method of deliberate protection against smallpox was well established in several Chinese provinces. A method so audacious in practice that it would take the Western world more than a century to accept it. The principle was this: a practitioner would obtain material from the pustules of a person suffering from a mild case of smallpox. This material, dried scabs, typically would be ground into a fine powder. Then, using a slender pipe, sometimes fashioned from silver, the practitioner would blow the powder into the nostril of a healthy person. The left nostril for boys, the right nostril for girls. Whether this distinction carried medical reasoning or ritual significance is unclear, but the procedure was consistent and deliberate. What followed was anxious waiting. Within days, the recipient would develop a fever, a mild eruption, a brief illness. In most cases, recovery came within a week or two, and after recovery, something remarkable had occurred. The person was protected. The great terror of the age had been met on controlled terms and overcome. This was variolation. The word itself would come later, derived from the Latin name for the disease. But the idea, the radical, counterintuitive idea that one could prevent a devastating illness by deliberately inviting a small, managed encounter with it, was already alive in Chinese medical thought centuries before any European physician arrived at a similar conclusion. The technique was not without peril. A small but real fraction of those who underwent the procedure developed not a mild case but a severe one. Some did not survive. The practitioners understood this risk. Various methods were employed to reduce it, selecting material only from patients with mild symptoms, aging the dried scabs to weaken their potency, choosing the season carefully. They were gambling knowingly. But the alternative was worse, an uncontrolled encounter with a disease that showed no mercy. Far to the southwest, on the Indian subcontinent, a parallel tradition had developed along strikingly different lines. Here, the method was cutaneous rather than nasal. Itinerant practitioners known as tikadars traveled from village to village, carrying a small, sharp instrument and material taken from smallpox sufferers. The tikadar would make a shallow scratch on the arm, introduce a small quantity, and bind the wound. The process was sometimes accompanied by dietary instructions. The patient was to eat lightly, avoid certain foods, rest in a cool place. But in India, the practice was inseparable from the religious world in which it operated. Smallpox was associated with the goddess Shitala, a complex, ambivalent figure who was both the cause of the disease and the source of its relief. Shitala was worshipped, feared, and propitiated. Temples were built in her name. Her arrival in a household in the form of the disease was understood not merely as a medical event, but as a divine visitation. The tikadars operated within this framework. They were not simply medical technicians. They were intermediaries between the human and the sacred, performing a procedure that was simultaneously practical and devotional. Western observers who later encountered the tikadars often dismissed them as superstitious folk healers, failing to recognize the empirical knowledge beneath their rituals. The tikadars had learned, through generations of observation, which material produced milder reactions, which patients were most likely to benefit, which seasons were safest. Their knowledge was not codified in the language of European natural philosophy, but it was knowledge nonetheless, hard-won, carefully transmitted, and demonstrably effective. And then there was the Ottoman Empire. In Constantinople, variolation was practiced not by physicians or itinerant specialists, but by women. Elderly Greek and Circassian women, operating within domestic spaces, performed the procedure as a routine part of child-rearing. A needle or small blade was used to make several shallow scratches on the skin, and a tiny amount of material from a mild case was introduced. The practice was so commonplace that it was organized socially. Groups of women would gather during the autumn months and arrange what later European observers described as engrafting parties. Children were inoculated together, monitored together, nursed through their brief illness collectively. What is striking about the Ottoman practice is its invisibility to the Western world. Constantinople in the early 1700s was home to a large European diplomatic community, ambassadors, merchants, clergy from a dozen nations. Yet for decades, variolation remained almost unknown to them. It existed in a sphere, the domestic, the female, the non-elite, that the Western diplomatic world simply did not observe. The knowledge was there, practiced openly, discussed freely among the local population. But the social architecture of cultural contact ensured that the people most likely to transmit this knowledge were the least likely to be consulted. This is one of the most instructive silences in the history of medicine. For centuries, European physicians had searched desperately for some protection against smallpox, and for centuries, effective methods had existed in China, in India, and in the very city where European diplomats maintained their embassies. The knowledge gap was not geographic. It was cultural, the gap between who was considered a legitimate source of medical wisdom and who was not. The practitioners were women, folk healers, people without university credentials, from societies that European intellectual culture regarded with varying degrees of condescension and dismissal. The great universities of Europe, Padua, Leiden, Edinburgh, were producing learned treatises on disease, debating humoral theory, conducting elaborate anatomical demonstrations. Yet the most important practical advance against the most devastating disease of the age had been developed by anonymous practitioners whose methods were transmitted orally, whose names went unrecorded, and whose traditions European science considered beneath serious attention. The question was not whether a solution existed. It was whether anyone with the credibility to bridge the cultural divide would notice it and carry it westward. That bridge, when it appeared, took an unlikely form. Not a physician, not a natural philosopher, but a woman, aristocratic and sharp-witted, personally marked by the disease, who found herself in Constantinople at precisely the right moment and possessed something rarer than medical training: the willingness to look at a foreign practice without prejudice and recognize that it worked. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was not a woman easily ignored. Born in 1689 into the English aristocracy, she had grown up surrounded by books, political conversation, and the sharp-edged social world of early Georgian England. She taught herself Latin as a girl, wrote poetry that circulated among London's literary circles, and eloped with Edward Wortley Montagu against her father's wishes, a decision that revealed a temperament more inclined toward conviction than convention. She was also intimately acquainted with smallpox. In December of 1715, the disease found her in London. She survived, but the illness stripped her of the celebrated beauty that had made her one of the most admired women in English society. Her eyelashes were gone. Her skin was left permanently marked. She knew what the disease could take because it had taken it from her. And her brother, who had contracted smallpox not long before, had not survived at all. In 1716, her husband was appointed ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. Lady Mary arrived in Constantinople not as a passive diplomatic spouse, but as a relentless observer, writing letters of extraordinary vividness that would later be published as the Turkish Embassy Letters. She described architecture, customs, social hierarchies, and the lives of Ottoman women, a world almost entirely inaccessible to male European visitors, but open to her precisely because of her sex. It was within that world that she encountered variolation. In a letter from the spring of 1717, she described elderly women who performed the procedure every autumn, small gatherings where children were inoculated together, a technique so routine that it provoked no anxiety among the local population. She noted the method with precision: a needle material from a mild case, shallow scratches in the skin. She noted the results: brief fever, mild eruption, and lasting protection. For Lady Mary, this was not a curiosity. It was a revelation. She had lost her beauty to smallpox and her brother to its worst outcome. Here, in a city most of her countrymen regarded as backward, ordinary women had solved a problem that the finest European physicians could not. She did not hesitate. In March of 1718, she ordered the embassy surgeon, Charles Maitland, to variolate her 5-year-old son. Maitland was reluctant. The procedure was foreign to his medical training. But Lady Mary insisted. The boy was inoculated, developed a mild case, and recovered quickly. 3 years later, back in London, a severe smallpox outbreak swept through the city. Lady Mary had her 3-year-old daughter variolated publicly, with witnesses. The child recovered without complications. The reaction was immediate and polarized. The objections revealed as much about English society as about medicine. The practice came from the Ottoman Empire, from a Muslim society, and was championed by a woman without medical credentials. Physicians resented being instructed by a layperson. Clergymen questioned the morality of deliberately introducing disease into a healthy body. Satirists mocked the adoption of Turkish customs. Xenophobia, professional jealousy, and genuine uncertainty formed a formidable wall of opposition. But Lady Mary had allies where it mattered. Caroline of Ansbach, Princess of Wales, a woman of considerable intelligence, was interested. She had children of her own to protect. She wanted evidence, and to obtain it, she authorized an experiment that occupied deeply uncomfortable ground even by 18th century standards. In the summer of 1721, 6 condemned prisoners in Newgate Prison were offered a bargain: submit to variolation, and if you survive, walk free. 3 men and 3 women, all awaiting execution, agreed. Maitland performed the procedure under observation by members of the Royal College of Physicians. All 6 developed mild symptoms. All 6 recovered. All 6 were released. To further test the protective effect, one of the freed prisoners, a 19-year-old woman, was sent to nurse a smallpox patient in Hertford, deliberately exposing herself to the disease. She remained healthy. Princess Caroline, satisfied, had her own daughters variolated in 1722. The royal endorsement shifted the balance. Variolation began to gain a cautious foothold among the English aristocracy. 3,000 miles west, a parallel story unfolded within the deepest moral complexities of the colonial world. In Boston, the Puritan minister Cotton Mather had learned of variolation from Onesimus, an enslaved African man in his household, who described a practice common in his homeland. Material from a smallpox sore was introduced into a small wound, producing mild illness and subsequent protection. Mather recognized the significance and began researching the practice. When a devastating outbreak struck Boston in 1721, Mather found a physician willing to act. Zabdiel Boylston, a local doctor, began variolating Bostonians, starting with his own son and 2 enslaved members of his household, then expanding to volunteers. The backlash was ferocious. Boylston was threatened with prosecution. A crude explosive was hurled through Mather's window. It failed to detonate but carried a message promising retribution. The city's newspaper waged a sustained campaign against inoculation, giving voice to physicians, clergymen, and citizens who viewed the practice as reckless or impious. Yet the numbers were unambiguous. Of nearly 300 variolated Bostonians, roughly 1 in 40 did not survive, a real risk, but vastly lower than the 1 in 7 toll among those who contracted smallpox naturally. The arithmetic pointed in only one direction. But variolation remained a dangerous compromise. Every inoculated person carried the actual virus. Every one of them could transmit the disease to others. The protection it offered was purchased at a price that could never be fully controlled. Variolation saved thousands. It also claimed some. It was a bridge, essential, imperfect, and temporary. Somewhere there had to be something better, a way to confer protection without introducing the disease itself. For 70 years after Lady Mary's campaign, no one could identify what that method might be. The answer, when it emerged, would come not from London's courts or Edinburgh's universities, but from the quiet countryside of Western England, and from a piece of folk wisdom so commonplace that most physicians had never bothered to investigate it. The village of Berkeley sits in the green, rolling lowlands of Gloucestershire, where the River Severn widens toward the Bristol Channel, and the fields are dotted with grazing cattle. In the late 18th century, it was a quiet, unremarkable place, a market town surrounded by dairy farms, far from the intellectual ferment of London or the great medical faculties of Edinburgh. It was not the kind of place where one might expect the course of human history to change. And yet it was here, among hedgerows and milking parlors, that a country doctor spent decades turning a piece of rural folklore into the most consequential medical innovation the world had ever seen. Edward Jenner was born in Berkeley in 1749, the son of a local clergyman. Orphaned young, he was apprenticed at 13 to a surgeon in the nearby town of Sodbury. It was during this apprenticeship that he first heard the claim that would define his life. A young dairymaid, consulting the surgeon about some ailment, mentioned in passing that she could never contract smallpox because she had already had cowpox. The remark was casual, the kind of thing country people simply knew. But it lodged in the young apprentice's mind and never left. Jenner later traveled to London to study under John Hunter, one of the most celebrated surgeons of the age, a man of enormous energy who advocated a philosophy of medicine rooted in direct observation rather than inherited dogma. The principal Hunter impressed upon his student to test ideas through experiment rather than speculation shaped Jenner's entire approach to science. Yet Jenner did not remain in London. He returned to Berkeley and settled into the life of a rural physician. He was also a naturalist of genuine talent. His study of cuckoo nesting behavior earned him election as a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1789. He was a man trained in careful observation, comfortable with the rhythms of the natural world, and accustomed to looking closely at things others took for granted. And throughout these years, the milkmaid's remark stayed with him. Cowpox was a well-known nuisance in the dairy counties. It was mild, uncomfortable, but not dangerous, transmitted from cattle to the people who milked them. What dairy communities had noticed over generations was that milkmaids who had suffered through cowpox seemed untouched by smallpox. Their faces were smooth, their skin unmarked. In a world where pockmarked features were the norm, the milkmaid's clear complexion was proverbial, and the reason was common knowledge in every farmhouse in Gloucestershire. No physician had ever investigated the claim systematically. It was folk wisdom, the kind educated men dismissed as peasant superstition. Jenner spent years gathering evidence informally, questioning dairy workers, recording cases. By the 1790s, he was convinced the folk belief was correct. What he needed was proof. The opportunity arrived in the spring of 1796. A milkmaid named Sarah Nelmes came to Jenner with fresh cowpox lesions on her hand, contracted from a cow called Blossom. On the 14th of May, Jenner took material from one of these lesions and introduced it, through 2 small incisions, into the arm of James Phipps, an 8-year-old boy, the son of his gardener. What followed unfolded with the slow tension of a wager whose outcome would not be known for weeks. The boy developed a slight fever. A single lesion appeared at the incision site. He felt unwell briefly, then recovered fully. But the real question had not yet been answered. On the 1st of July, roughly 7 weeks later, Jenner took the critical step. He variolated James Phipps with material from an actual smallpox case. If cowpox had conferred no protection, the child would develop the disease with all its attendant risks. If the folk wisdom was right, nothing would happen. Nothing happened. No fever, no eruption, no illness of any kind. Jenner repeated the challenge several weeks later. Again, nothing. Cowpox had rendered James Phipps resistant to smallpox without ever exposing him to the disease itself. Here the narrative must confront an uncomfortable truth. By any standard after Jenner's own era, the experiment was ethically indefensible. An 8-year-old child of a man who worked for Jenner was subjected to an untested procedure, then deliberately exposed to one of the most devastating diseases in existence. There was no precedent, no safety data, no informed consent. Jenner was gambling not with his own body, but with the body of a child who could not understand the stakes. The 18th century did not see it this way. Experimentation on children and the socially powerless was not unusual in an age when variolation had been tested on prisoners and orphans. Context does not erase the ethical discomfort, but it prevents the easy condemnation that comes from judging the past entirely by the standards of the present. Jenner submitted his findings to the Royal Society. They declined, advising that his evidence was insufficient. Undeterred, he gathered additional cases and in 1798 published privately an inquiry into the causes and effects of the variolae vaccinae. The title was dry. The contents were revolutionary, and buried in the Latin was a word destined to outlast everything else Jenner wrote: vaccinae, from vacca, cow. Vaccination, a term born in a Gloucestershire milking parlor, rooted in the observation of country folk, destined to become one of the most important words in the history of medicine. The reception was contentious. Some physicians replicated Jenner's results with enthusiasm. Others dismissed the enterprise as rural quackery. In 1802, the satirist James Gilray published a famous etching depicting vaccinated patients sprouting miniature cows from their bodies, a grotesque fantasy that captured genuine public unease about introducing animal material into human flesh. But evidence accumulated faster than ridicule. Physicians across Europe and the Atlantic tested cowpox inoculation and confirmed its effectiveness. Unlike variolation, vaccination carried no risk of causing actual smallpox. The recipient could not transmit the disease. It was safer, simpler, and crucially, it could be scaled. Cowpox material could be obtained from cattle and distributed far more widely than variolation ever allowed. Within a few years, the practice was spreading across Europe. Jenner found himself celebrated as a benefactor of humanity. Honors arrived from foreign governments. He received financial grants from Parliament. Yet he remained in Berkeley, watching with a mixture of pride and unease as his discovery traveled beyond his control. He understood that what he had demonstrated was a principle, not a finished system. The quality of vaccine material varied. Preservation methods were imperfect. And whether a single vaccination conferred lifelong protection remained unanswered. He had opened a door. What lay beyond it, the vast, politically charged story of how vaccination would be adopted, resisted, and ultimately deployed on a global scale, was a journey that would take not years but centuries. And it would begin almost immediately with one of the most extraordinary medical expeditions ever undertaken. The speed at which Jenner's discovery crossed borders was remarkable even by the standards of an age when ideas already traveled faster than armies. Within 2 years of the inquiry's publication, cowpox vaccination had reached Geneva, Vienna, and several German states. Within 5 years, it had crossed the Atlantic to the young American Republic, where President Thomas Jefferson, himself a man of scientific inclination, took a personal interest in its promotion and corresponded with Jenner directly, expressing the conviction that vaccination would one day erase smallpox from the catalog of human afflictions. The idea, once released, proved almost impossible to contain. It appealed simultaneously to humanitarian impulse, to military pragmatism, and to the ambitions of governments that had long understood the economic cost of a disease that disabled soldiers, emptied workhouses, and claimed the young in appalling numbers. No figure of the era grasped the strategic dimension more quickly than Napoleon Bonaparte. The French emperor, who had built the most powerful military machine in Europe, understood that smallpox was as great a threat to his armies as any coalition of enemy states. He ordered the vaccination of his entire military force, a logistical undertaking of enormous scale that reflected not sentimentality but cold calculation. When Jenner personally petitioned Napoleon for the release of certain English prisoners of war, the emperor is said to have remarked to his advisors that he could refuse nothing to a man who had given such a gift to humanity. Whether the anecdote is precisely true or slightly embellished by later admirers matters less than what it reveals. Within a decade of his private publication, the country doctor from Berkeley had become an international figure whose influence extended even into the courts of his nation's enemies. But the most extraordinary chapter in the early global spread of vaccination was not written in the palaces of Europe. It was written aboard a small Spanish sailing vessel, crossing the Atlantic with a cargo more precious and more troubling than anything in its hold. In 1803, King Charles IV of Spain authorized an expedition unlike any the world had seen. Its purpose was singular: to carry the smallpox vaccine from Spain to every corner of the Spanish colonial empire, the Americas, the Philippines, and beyond. The mission was placed under the direction of Francisco Javier de Balmes, a military physician with experience in the colonies and a passionate advocate for vaccination. Its official name was the Royal Philanthropic Vaccine Expedition, and its practical challenge was one that no amount of royal authority could simplify. The problem was biological. In 1803, there was no way to preserve cowpox vaccine in a stable form for a long sea voyage. The material lost its potency within days. It could not be dried, bottled, or frozen with the technology available. The only reliable method of keeping the vaccine alive across weeks and months of ocean travel was to maintain it in living human tissue, to pass it, arm to arm, from one person to the next, each new recipient keeping the chain unbroken until the ship reached its destination. Balmes' solution was as ingenious as it was ethically harrowing. He brought aboard 22 boys, orphans from the foundling houses of Spain, none older than 10, most between 3 and 9 years of age. Every 9 or 10 days during the voyage, 2 of the boys would be vaccinated using material from the arms of the 2 who had been vaccinated just before them. Each pair of small arms served as a living vessel, carrying the vaccine westward across thousands of miles of open ocean. The chain could not be allowed to break. If it did, the entire mission would fail. The boys were accompanied by Isabel Zendel Gomez, the rectress of the foundling house in A Coruña, who served as their caretaker throughout the voyage. She fed them, nursed them through their mild fevers, comforted them during the long weeks at sea, and ensured that the delicate schedule of arm-to-arm transfers was maintained. Zendel Gomez has been largely overlooked by history, but her role was indispensable. She was, in practical terms, the person who kept the vaccine alive. Without her daily, unglamorous, exhausting labor, the expedition would have collapsed before it ever reached the Caribbean. The ethical weight of the enterprise is impossible to ignore. These were orphans, children without parents, without advocates, without anyone to refuse on their behalf. They were selected precisely because no one would object. They were instruments of a public health campaign conceived by adults who would never have subjected their own children to the same role. The expedition saved tens of thousands of lives in the years that followed. It also used powerless children as biological infrastructure, and no amount of historical distance should obscure that fact. The expedition reached Puerto Rico in February of 1804, then moved on to Venezuela, Cuba, and Mexico. At each stop, Balmes organized local vaccination campaigns, trained local practitioners, and established juntas, local boards charged with maintaining the vaccine supply and continuing the work after the expedition departed. In Mexico, the expedition split. Balmes himself sailed westward across the Pacific to the Philippines and eventually to the Portuguese colony of Macau and the Chinese port of Canton, while his deputy, José Salvini, led a southern branch through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. Salvini's journey was grueling. He traveled for years through mountain passes, tropical lowlands, and regions torn by political instability. His health deteriorated steadily. He did not survive the expedition, succumbing to illness in Cochabamba, Bolivia, in 1812, having spent nearly a decade carrying the vaccine across a continent. The Balmes expedition has been called the first global public health campaign in history. Its scale, its ambition, and its practical ingenuity were without precedent. It demonstrated that vaccination was not merely a medical technique, but a logistical and political undertaking, one that required ships, supply chains, trained personnel, institutional support, and the cooperation of local authorities across vast distances. It was a preview, in miniature, of the global campaigns that would follow more than a century and a half later. Meanwhile, in Europe, vaccination was becoming a matter of state policy. The Grand Duchy of Bavaria made it compulsory in 1807, the first government in the world to do so. Denmark followed in 1810. The Kingdom of Sweden, where the physician Eberhard Monk af Rosenskjöld had been among the earliest European practitioners to adopt Jenner's method, established systematic vaccination programs that dramatically reduced smallpox incidence within a generation. In Britain, the National Vaccine Establishment was founded in 1808 to oversee the production and distribution of vaccine material, though its early operations were hampered by administrative inefficiency and a chronic shortage of reliable supply. Institutionalization brought undeniable benefits. It transformed vaccination from a private, voluntary act into a coordinated public health measure. But it also introduced new problems. The most significant was the continued reliance on arm-to-arm vaccination, the same method the Bommies expedition had used at sea. In civilian practice, this meant that vaccine material was passed from one child's arm to the next, sometimes through dozens of intermediary recipients before reaching its final destination. The process was slow, dependent on a steady supply of willing participants, and vulnerable to a risk that no one had fully anticipated. In several documented cases across Europe, arm-to-arm vaccination transmitted not only the cowpox vaccine, but also other diseases present in the source patient, most notoriously syphilis. Outbreaks of vaccine-associated syphilis were recorded in Italy, France, and Germany, causing public alarm that far exceeded the statistical scale of the problem. The episodes were rare, but they were devastating to public confidence. Parents who had accepted vaccination willingly began to hesitate. The promise of protection suddenly carried an asterisk, a whispered caveat. The vaccine might be safe, or it might carry something worse than what it prevented. These concerns were not irrational. They were grounded in real events, in documented harm, in a system of vaccine production that was genuinely imperfect. And they fed a growing current of resistance that would, in the decades to come, transform into one of the most significant public health controversies of the 19th century. The question was no longer simply whether vaccination worked. It did. The question was whether governments had the right to compel it, and what happened when citizens refused. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. What had begun as a gift, a voluntary procedure offered by physicians, accepted with gratitude by those who understood the alternative, was becoming a command. And wherever the state commanded, resistance gathered like storm clouds along a horizon that had, until recently, seemed clear. In 1853, the British Parliament passed the Vaccination Act, making smallpox vaccination compulsory for every infant in England and Wales within 3 months of birth. The law reflected a straightforward public health logic. Smallpox was still claiming thousands of lives each year. Vaccination had been shown to prevent it, and universal coverage was the fastest route to suppressing the disease. To the legislators who drafted the act, the case was self-evident. To a significant portion of the population expected to comply, it was anything but. The Act of 1853 contained no meaningful enforcement mechanism. Compliance was uneven, resistance was widespread, and the law changed little in practice. So in 1867, Parliament strengthened it. The new Vaccination Act imposed fines on parents who refused to have their children vaccinated. Repeated refusal could lead to repeated fines, and in some cases, to the seizure of personal property or even imprisonment. Vaccination officers were appointed, government agents authorized to visit homes, inspect children, and report noncompliance. For many families, particularly among the working poor, the knock of a vaccination officer at the door became a symbol not of medical progress, but of state intrusion into the most intimate domain of family life. The opposition that crystallized in response was neither simple nor monolithic. It drew from multiple sources, spoke in multiple voices, and advanced arguments that ranged from the deeply principled to the frankly conspiratorial. To dismiss it as mere ignorance, as many public health advocates of the era did, is to misunderstand both its character and its enduring significance. The most visceral resistance came from working-class communities, and it was rooted less in ideology than in lived experience. For a laboring family in industrial England, compulsory vaccination arrived in a context of pervasive inequality. The state that now demanded access to their children's bodies was the same state that tolerated overcrowded housing, contaminated water supplies, dangerous factory conditions, and wages insufficient to feed a family. The government offered little in the way of social protection, yet it insisted on this one particular intervention, backed by penalties that fell exclusively on those least able to pay. A factory worker fined 5 shillings for refusing vaccination lost a significant portion of a week's wages. A wealthy family, if it chose to refuse, could absorb the fine without inconvenience. The law was formally equal and practically regressive, and working-class communities understood this with perfect clarity. There were also legitimate medical concerns that the public health establishment was often too slow to acknowledge. Arm-to-arm vaccination, still the dominant method of vaccine distribution through much of the 19th century, carried real risks. The documented cases of syphilis transmission through contaminated vaccine material were few in number but enormous in impact. Parents who had heard of such incidents through newspapers, pamphlets, or word of mouth were not being irrational when they hesitated. They were responding to genuine evidence of genuine harm, filtered through a network of informal communication that the medical establishment neither controlled nor fully understood. Beyond the practical objections lay deeper currents of philosophical and religious dissent. For some, the opposition was theological. Disease was an expression of divine will, and vaccination represented a presumptuous interference with the natural order ordained by providence. If God had seen fit to send smallpox into the world, then it was not for human beings to circumvent his design through artificial means. This argument carried particular weight in dissenting Protestant communities, where suspicion of established authority, both ecclesiastical and governmental, ran deep. For others, the objection was political and constitutional. The anti-vaccination movement of the 19th century produced some of the earliest and most articulate arguments for what would later be called bodily autonomy, the principle that the individual, not the state, holds ultimate authority over what is done to his or her own body. This was not a fringe position. It was advanced by radicals, by liberals, by early champions of civil liberties who saw compulsory vaccination as a precedent with alarming implications. If the government could compel a medical procedure today, what might it compel tomorrow? The body, they argued, was sovereign territory. The state had no right to cross its borders without consent. These arguments converged most dramatically in the city of Leicester. By the 1880s, Leicester had become the epicenter of organized anti-vaccination sentiment in England, a manufacturing city with a strong tradition of working-class political engagement and a deep suspicion of centralized authority. Vaccination rates in Leicester had fallen sharply, and the city's magistrates were issuing hundreds of fines and summonses against non-compliant parents. The tension was building toward a confrontation. It arrived on the 23rd of March, 1885. On that day, an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people filled the streets of Leicester in one of the largest public demonstrations in 19th century England. The crowd carried banners, effigies, and a child's coffin, a symbolic representation of the children they believed had been harmed by compulsory vaccination. They marched through the city center, past the magistrates' courts where their neighbors had been fined, and gathered to hear speeches denouncing the vaccination acts as tyrannical, medically dangerous, and morally indefensible. The Leicester demonstration was not a riot. It was an organized, disciplined expression of democratic dissent, and it had practical consequences. In the years that followed, Leicester's public health authorities adopted an alternative approach that became known as the Leicester Method. Instead of universal vaccination, the city relied on rapid identification and isolation of smallpox cases, quarantine of contacts, and improvements to sanitation and housing. The strategy was, in modern epidemiological terms, a form of surveillance and containment, and in the short term, it proved surprisingly effective. Leicester's smallpox incidence declined significantly, and the city's example emboldened anti-vaccination movements across England and beyond. Whether the Leicester method would have succeeded indefinitely, or whether it worked primarily because surrounding regions maintained high vaccination rates, effectively providing a buffer of herd immunity that Leicester itself was depleting, remains a matter of historical and epidemiological debate. What is not debatable is the political impact. The Leicester movement, and the broader agitation it represented, forced the British government to retreat. In 1898, a new Vaccination Act introduced a provision that had no precedent in British law, the Conscientious Objection Clause. For the first time, a parent could legally refuse vaccination for a child by declaring before a magistrate that he or she held a sincere conviction that vaccination was harmful or morally wrong. The state, in effect, conceded that it could not compel a medical procedure against the genuine convictions of its citizens. The clause was imperfect. Many magistrates made the process humiliating and difficult, demanding that parents justify their beliefs in detail. But the principle it established was profound. It marked the first formal recognition in British legal history that individual conscience could override a public health mandate. The 1898 Act did not end the debate. It merely shifted its terms. Anti-vaccination societies continued to publish pamphlets, organize meetings, and challenge the medical establishment's authority. Meanwhile, advances in vaccine production gradually addressed some of the movement's most legitimate grievances. By the late 19th century, animal-derived vaccine, produced from calves rather than passed arm to arm between human recipients, was replacing the older method, eliminating the risk of transmitting human diseases through the vaccination process. The vaccine became safer, more standardized, and more reliable, but the damage to public trust, once inflicted, proved far more difficult to repair than any technical deficiency. A historian examining the anti-vaccination movement of the 19th century cannot help but notice the uncanny resonance with controversies that would emerge more than a century later. The arguments of government overreach, bodily sovereignty, distrust of medical institutions, suspicion that the risks of the procedure were being concealed by those who profited from its mandate, reappear with striking fidelity in debates that continue to this day. The specific diseases change. The specific vaccines change. The underlying tensions between individual liberty and collective welfare, between expert authority and popular skepticism, between the state's duty to protect and the citizen's right to refuse, remain remarkably constant. This is not to suggest that the 19th century anti-vaccinationists were right, or that their modern counterparts are their direct heirs. It is simply to observe that compulsory public health measures, however well-intentioned and however well-supported by evidence, inevitably provoke resistance, and that this resistance, whatever its scientific merits, speaks to anxieties about power, autonomy, and trust that no amount of data alone can resolve. While Europe debated, smallpox did not wait. The disease continued its ancient work across the globe, not in the industrialized nations where vaccination infrastructure was steadily improving, but in the vast regions of Asia, Africa, and Latin America where such infrastructure was fragile, underfunded, or entirely absent. By the middle of the 20th century, smallpox was still claiming an estimated 2 million lives every year, overwhelmingly among the poorest and most vulnerable populations on Earth. The question was no longer whether vaccination worked. That had been settled. The question was whether humanity possessed the collective will, the organizational capacity, and the political coordination to finish what a country doctor in Gloucestershire had started nearly 2 centuries before. In 1967, smallpox remained endemic in 31 countries, stretching across a belt of vulnerability from the Horn of Africa through the Indian subcontinent to the Indonesian archipelago. Between 10 and 15 million people contracted the disease each year, and roughly 2 million, disproportionately children, disproportionately poor, did not survive. In wealthy nations, smallpox had been effectively eliminated through decades of vaccination. But for much of the rest of the world, the disease remained what it had always been, an ever-present shadow woven into daily existence. The idea of total eradication had been discussed for years. The Soviet Union had proposed a global campaign to the World Health Assembly in 1958. A resolution passed, but for nearly a decade the effort languished, underfunded, politically uneven, and widely doubted. No human disease had ever been deliberately eliminated. The concept struck many senior epidemiologists as utopian. What changed in 1967 was the machinery assembled to pursue it. The World Health Organization launched the Intensified Smallpox Eradication Program, and at its center stood a man who had not wanted the job. Donald Ainsley Henderson was an American epidemiologist, direct, pragmatic, and temperamentally allergic to bureaucratic nonsense. He had resisted the assignment, preferring his existing work in Atlanta and skeptical of United Nations politics. But once installed in Geneva, he threw himself into the task with relentless energy. Henderson understood that the program's greatest enemy was not the virus, but the assumption that mass vaccination alone could achieve eradication. In countries with limited infrastructure, vast rural populations, and unreliable transportation, reaching every individual was impossible. Vaccination rates of 80 or 90% were unattainable where health workers could not reach half the population. The breakthrough came from a shift in strategy. Instead of vaccinating entire populations, the program adopted surveillance and containment, later called ring vaccination. The principle was deceptively simple: find every case quickly, identify every contact, vaccinate everyone in the surrounding area, creating a barrier the virus could not cross. Instead of chasing the population, the program would chase the disease itself, extinguishing each outbreak before it could spread. This demanded speed, local knowledge, and an intelligence network capable of detecting cases within days. It also required a tool that had recently become available: the bifurcated needle. This slim steel instrument with a forked tip held a tiny droplet of vaccine between its prongs. It was cheaper than a syringe, easier to use, required minimal training, and far less vaccine per dose. A health worker with bifurcated needles and freeze-dried vaccine could operate in remote villages, refugee camps, even war zones. No refrigeration needed, no electricity, only a steady hand and a willing arm. India was the most daunting theater. With over 600 million people and tens of thousands of active cases, the subcontinent seemed designed to defeat the program. Mass vaccination campaigns had achieved impressive coverage but failed to interrupt transmission. The virus kept finding pockets: migrants, slum dwellers, religious pilgrims, reigniting outbreaks faster than vaccinators could contain them. The turning point came in 1973 and 74, when the program shifted decisively to surveillance and containment. Hundreds of thousands of health workers were mobilized for house-to-house searches across entire states. A reward was offered for reporting confirmed cases, modest at first, later increased. It transformed the population from passive recipients into active surveillance participants. Information flowed upward from villages to district offices with unprecedented speed. The effort was grueling and punctuated by setbacks. Outbreaks contained in one district flared in another, flooding displaced populations. Political resistance made some regions difficult to access, but the strategy held. India recorded its last case in May of 1975, a young woman named Sabin Bibai in Bihar. Bangladesh presented equally formidable challenges, compounded by recent war, poverty, and catastrophic flooding. In October of 1975, a 3-year-old girl named Rahima Banu on the remote island of Bola was identified as the last known case of variola major, the more severe form. The variant that had claimed emperors and emptied continents had infected its last human host. But smallpox was not finished. Variola minor persisted in the Horn of Africa, where war, drought, and refugee movements created conditions almost perfectly suited to the virus. Ethiopia and Somalia became the final battleground. The campaign there was conducted under near-impossible circumstances: military conflicts, displaced populations, regions without roads, communication limited to shortwave radio. And yet, case by case, the ring closed. On the 26th of October 1977, a 23-year-old hospital cook named Ali Malin walked into a clinic in the port town of Merka, southern Somalia, with a fever and a rash. He was diagnosed with variola minor. He had never been vaccinated, an irony not lost on anyone, given that he worked in a hospital. He was isolated. His contacts were traced. A ring of vaccination was established with the efficiency that eradication teams had refined to instinctive precision. Malin recovered. He was the last human being on Earth to contract smallpox through natural transmission. The chain of infection stretching back through millennia, through ancient Egypt, through the devastation of the Americas, through European courts and industrial slums, ended in a modest Somali clinic, in the body of a young cook who had simply never gotten around to being vaccinated. The months that followed were tense, meticulous verification. Surveillance teams searched across the Horn of Africa and beyond. Every rumor was investigated. Every suspicious rash was tested. Weeks became months. No new cases appeared. Malin himself was profoundly affected by his role. He became a public health worker, first in tuberculosis, then in polio eradication, working to vaccinate the populations among whom he had been the last link in smallpox's chain. He continued until his passing in 2013, taken not by the disease that made him famous but by malaria, another ancient adversary humanity has not yet defeated. The silence held. The world had done something never done before, but before victory could be declared, one final episode would remind everyone that the virus, even in apparent defeat, retained the capacity to inflict one last wound. The wound came not from the jungles of Africa or the villages of South Asia, but from a university building in the English city of Birmingham, a place where the virus was supposed to be safely contained behind laboratory walls. On the 11th of September 1978, a medical photographer named Janet Parker fell ill. She worked at the University of Birmingham's medical school, in a studio located one floor above the laboratory of Professor Henry Bedson, one of the last researchers in the world still conducting active work with live smallpox virus. Parker had not been vaccinated recently. She had no known contact with any smallpox patient. But the building's ventilation system, it would later be determined, connected her workspace to the laboratory below through service ducts that had never been properly sealed. The virus, contained in one of the most sophisticated research facilities in Britain, had traveled through the ductwork and found its way to the one person in the building whose immunity had waned enough to leave her vulnerable. Parker developed a rash, then a fever. She was initially misdiagnosed, an understandable error in a country where no physician in active practice had seen a case of smallpox in years. By the time the correct diagnosis was made, days had passed. Her mother, who had been caring for her, contracted the disease as well, though she would ultimately recover. Parker herself was not so fortunate. She was transferred to an isolation hospital where her condition deteriorated steadily. On the 11th of September, precisely 1 year to the day after the diagnosis of Ali Malin in Somalia, Janet Parker succumbed to smallpox. She was the last person in recorded history to perish from the disease. The aftermath was devastating in ways that extended far beyond a single life lost. Professor Bedson, who had devoted his career to smallpox research and who understood immediately the implications of the laboratory breach, was consumed by a guilt so overwhelming that it defied any professional framework of response. Within days of Parker's diagnosis, before the investigation into the accident had even concluded, Bedson met a tragic and solitary end, leaving behind a note expressing his anguish at the catastrophe his laboratory had caused. The University of Birmingham's smallpox research program was shut down. The facility was decontaminated. The episode sent shockwaves through the international scientific community and through the World Health Organization, which had spent a decade working to eliminate the disease from nature only to watch it escape from a supposedly secure laboratory in one of the world's wealthiest and most scientifically advanced nations. The Birmingham incident crystallized a question that had been gathering force for years, a question that the eradication campaign's very success had made unavoidable. If smallpox no longer existed in nature, if the last natural case had already occurred, if the chain of transmission that stretched back thousands of years had finally been broken, then why did the virus still exist in laboratories? And what should be done about it? The immediate aftermath, the World Health Organization moved to consolidate. Prior to the Birmingham disaster, smallpox virus samples were held in laboratories in dozens of countries, research institutions, military facilities, university departments. The WHO issued a directive. All remaining stocks of variola virus were to be either destroyed or transferred to one of two designated repositories. The first was the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. The second was the Research Institute of Viral Preparations in Moscow, which would later transfer its collection to the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology known as Vector, located in Koltsovo, a small scientific town in Siberia near Novosibirsk. By the early 1980s, these two facilities, one American, one Soviet, were officially the only places on Earth where the smallpox virus continued to exist. Two freezers, two sets of locked doors, two layers of biosafety protocols separating humanity from an organism that had, over the course of recorded history, claimed more lives than any war, any famine, any other single disease. On the 8th of May, 1980, the 33rd World Health Assembly convened in Geneva and issued a declaration that had no precedent in the history of civilization. Smallpox, the Assembly announced, had been eradicated. The disease that had scarred the face of Rameses V, that had hollowed out the Aztec capital before the Spanish could take it, that had claimed European monarchs and Indian children and Somali hospital cooks, that disease was gone. Not reduced, not controlled, not suppressed. Gone, eliminated from the natural world through a deliberate, sustained, international act of collective will. The celebration was genuine. Photographs from that day show delegates applauding, embracing, weeping. Donald Henderson, the reluctant leader who had driven the program through a decade of logistical nightmares and political obstacles, permitted himself a rare public display of emotion. The men and women who had carried bifurcated needles into some of the most inhospitable places on Earth understood the magnitude of what they had accomplished. For the first time in the history of the species, a human disease had been intentionally destroyed. It was, by almost any reckoning, one of the finest achievements of international cooperation the world had ever seen. And yet the story did not end. The question of the remaining laboratory stocks, the frozen vials in Atlanta and Koltsovo, became, almost immediately, one of the most vexing problems in global biosecurity. The logic of destruction seemed compelling and straightforward. The virus had no natural reservoir outside those two freezers. Every day it continued to exist, it posed a risk, however small, of accidental release, as Birmingham had so painfully demonstrated. It posed a risk of theft, of deliberate misuse, of weaponization by states or non-state actors who might seek to exploit a world whose population was increasingly unvaccinated and therefore increasingly vulnerable. The simplest, safest course of action was obvious: destroy the stocks, autoclave the vials, eliminate the last traces of the organism and close the book forever. The arguments for preservation were more nuanced, and for many scientists equally compelling. Research on the live virus, its advocates contended, remained essential for the development of improved vaccines, more effective antiviral treatments, and better diagnostic tools. The existing smallpox vaccine, while effective, carried its own risks, particularly for immunocompromised individuals, and the development of safer alternatives required ongoing access to the pathogen. Moreover, the possibility of reemergence could not be entirely discounted. Variola virus DNA had been recovered from historical remains. Undiscovered laboratory stocks might exist in countries that had not fully complied with the WHO Consolidation Directive. And in an era of rapidly advancing synthetic biology, the complete genomic sequence of the variola virus, published and freely available in scientific databases, meant that the theoretical capacity to reconstruct the virus from scratch was no longer confined to the realm of science fiction. Destroying the official stocks, in other words, would eliminate the known copies but could not eliminate the knowledge. And if the virus were ever to return through an archaeological discovery, a clandestine laboratory, or deliberate synthesis, the world would need every tool at its disposal to respond. Having destroyed its own reference samples, the scientific community would be fighting with one hand tied behind its back. The debate has been revisited by the World Health Assembly repeatedly, in 1986, in 1996, in 2002, in 2011, and at regular intervals since. Destruction dates have been proposed and then postponed. Committees have deliberated. Reports have been commissioned. Each time, the decision has been deferred. The vials remain in their freezers, in Atlanta and in Kosovo, guarded by biosafety protocols of the highest order, inspected periodically by WHO representatives, their contents intact and their future unresolved. There is something almost literary about this impasse. The defeated enemy preserved in a glass coffin, too dangerous to release and too valuable to destroy. It is a dilemma that Jenner could never have imagined, that Henderson spent his later years grappling with, and that the world has chosen, so far, to leave suspended in a state of indefinite postponement. The virus exists in a kind of institutional limbo, no longer a living threat, not yet a historical artifact, hovering somewhere between the two in a bureaucratic purgatory that satisfies no one entirely, but that no one has mustered the consensus to end. And perhaps that irresolution is itself a fitting conclusion, or rather, a fitting refusal to conclude, for a story that spans so many centuries and so many contradictions. The history of smallpox and vaccination is a story of empirical wisdom dismissed because it came from the wrong people, of a medical breakthrough built on an experiment that no modern ethics board would approve, of a life-saving technology that provoked riots in the streets, of an international campaign that succeeded against extraordinary odds through the combined efforts of bureaucrats, field workers, village volunteers, and a reluctant epidemiologist who never wanted the job in the first place. It is a story about the movement of knowledge, from Chinese folk healers to Ottoman women to an English aristocrat to a country doctor to a Spanish ship full of orphans to a global institution headquartered in Geneva. At every stage, the knowledge crossed boundaries that were supposed to be impassable, boundaries of culture, of class, of gender, of professional credential, of geography. At every stage, someone had to look at an unfamiliar practice and recognize its value, an act that sounds simple in retrospect, but that, in the moment, required a quality rarer than intelligence, the willingness to admit that the answer might come from an unexpected direction. It is also a story about the tension between individual freedom and collective action, a tension that has never been resolved, and that, in all likelihood, never will be. The anti-vaccinationists of Leicester in 1885 and the public health architects of the WHO in 1967 occupied opposite ends of a spectrum that runs through every society that has ever tried to balance the rights of the person against the needs of the group. Neither end of that spectrum has a monopoly on wisdom. Neither can be dismissed without cost. And at the center of it all, at the very heart of this 300-year arc, is a single, astonishing fact. Humanity looked at its oldest and most merciless infectious enemy, an organism that had shaped the fate of civilizations, and decided not merely to fight it but to erase it from existence. And succeeded. That this happened, that it was even possible, remains one of the most remarkable things our species has ever done. The vials remain. The debate continues. The scars have faded from the faces of the living, and the children born into this century will never know what it meant to search an infant's skin for the first signs of a rash that once visited every household on Earth. The story of smallpox is, in one sense, complete. The disease is gone. But its echoes persist in the freezers of Atlanta and Kosovo, in the unresolved arguments about power and consent and the proper reach of the state, in the memory of all the unnamed millions who did not survive to see the victory, and in the quiet, extraordinary fact that a piece of folk wisdom passed from a milkmaid to a country doctor on a spring afternoon in 1796 set in motion a chain of events that would, 2 centuries later, rid the world of one of its oldest afflictions. The ending remains unwritten. Perhaps that is as it should be.